Welcome to our SupportEd webinar, Supporting ELLs Social Emotionally. We are really happy that you've decided to join us today. My name is Marley Zeno, and I will be presenting today's content. I'm an associate at SupportEd, and prior to working at SupportEd, I was an ELL coordinator and ENL teacher in Brooklyn, New York, working primarily with elementary school ELLs. And I was also an adjunct professor of TESOL at Hunter College in New York City. I wanted to take a moment before we get into any content to say thank you for all that you've done to adapt to a new normal of remote learning and teaching, often while supporting your own children in their own remote learning. And I've been so impressed by the creativity and the energy that I've seen from educators all across the country. And we really appreciate what you do, and we know your students do as well. And I especially appreciate you joining us in late June on a Monday morning. Before we get started, we'll take a look at our online platform, Zoom, in case you're not yet familiar with it. So take a moment to find your control bar, which is visible if you've downloaded Zoom. We'll be pausing for questions at the end of the presentation, and you can use the Q&A button to ask those kinds of questions. You can enter any content-related questions whenever you have one. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat button to let us know, and we'll also be using the chat function throughout the webinar to connect with each other. And when members of our team share information, like links that are important, they'll start with 3 asterisks in the chat, and they'll come from my colleague, Joanna. So the default setting in the chat is all panelists. We recommend that you set your chat to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages and you can share resources with one another. And again, messages from our team with these 3 asterisks will contain relevant links. And as a reminder, today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Long Island RBERN YouTube channel after the webinar. So we'll start using the chat function now, and please introduce yourself by entering, if you have not already, your full name and district, and this is how your attendance will be taken so you can receive CTLE credit. So, and every time you see this chat function in the bottom corner, it means we'll be using the chat function. Great, thank you. And you can keep those coming. If you attend the webinar live, you will receive a certificate for CTLE credit through My Learning Plan for 1 hour of professional development. We have 4 objectives for today's webinar. We expect that by the end of the webinar, you will be able to define the importance of establishing and maintaining routines for ELLs, explore strategies for maintaining connections with students and families, describe strategies for responding to ELLs' emotional needs, and apply social emotional support strategies in your own context. And today's webinar is divided into 4 sections framed around these objectives. We've created a Padlet online resource for you as a way we can share relevant resources. You can also use the Padlet to share your own resources and comment on the topic. And anyone who attends the webinar and has the link to the Padlet can add to the conversation at any time, and it will remain open indefinitely, so I encourage you to check out it periodically. And the link, Joanna has shared the link in the chat for us. So we have different columns for the different webinars we've been doing in this series. So today we'll be looking at this column over here, the 4th column, Supporting ELLs Social Emotionally. And the PDF of today's slides is also posted on this column. And the very last column contains a separate Padlet we made that's just resources for teaching ELLs online. So we'll also be sharing links in the chat to other distance learning resources, including the Padlet I mentioned earlier that has internet access resources, resources for communicating with parents and families, translation, resources for listening and speaking, virtual field trips. So definitely check that out as well. And we're adding to it as we see new resources. And we've also linked to our free webinar archive. So we'll begin by sharing in the chat, what have been your ELLs' biggest social emotional needs at this time? Feeling disconnected from friends and teachers, lack of peer interaction, lack of routine, disruption of structures, not having support, missing their friends, right? I'm seeing a lot of lack of social interaction, right? Even the inability to know what their needs are because students, you weren't able to connect with students in the first place, right? They miss that interaction. A lack of motivation, being easily distracted, right? Fear about getting sick and losing time, right? A lot of anxiety, misinformation. Students are experiencing depression and anxiety, isolation, right? A lack of prep time, right? Students had to make a huge shift in a matter of days. Frustration with technology. Some of our older students have to work essential jobs, right? So we know that our students faced a lot of socio-emotional needs right now. Thank you for sharing. So we'll start by talking about the importance of establishing and maintaining routines. And since there's still a lot of uncertainty about the fall around the country and in New York, we'll be talking about ways to set up, we'll be talking about both digital and non-digital ways to support ELLs that will hopefully be applicable to your contexts regardless of what schooling looks like in September. And if we are virtual again for some or all instruction, we can still focus on setting up routines. And that came up a lot in the chat that students were struggling with the lack of routine. So what can we do to make routines even when we're not with our students? So we want to take care to set up our physical space, even if it's just the tiny Zoom background behind us, with physical reminders of the classroom. So an article by Zakarian, Alvarez, Ortiz, and Haynes, which is linked on the Padlet, and this little paper crane icon, when you see it on the screen, means that whatever's on the screen is linked on the Padlet. So this article shared a teacher brought the class pet and added plants to sort of mimic the same warmth and visual from the classroom. That made it more warm and inviting. And it's a small thing, but it's the kind of thing that can make a big difference to students. And we want to make sure part of routine is familiarizing students with digital tools and setting agendas. And hopefully, unlike in the spring, we'll have a little more notice about what our learning models will look like. And this can give us time to actually train students on digital tools and set agendas and create more of a sense of routine. So if there's one thing that this abrupt transition to virtual learning has taught us, is that it needs to be flexible. Districts, schools, and families are all looking for learning structures and routines that will be most effective to help students continue their learning. In your own family, you might have had to teach at the same time your child is supposed to be doing science, or you may have students who are older siblings supervising a younger child. And all of these different situations make it challenging to set a routine that's going to work for all students. So as you begin establishing these routines, it's important to communicate the expectations to families. For example, is there certain assigned work that is required and other work that is optional? Are students expected to participate synchronously in online meetings, or can they do the work at times that work best for them and their families? And keep lines of communication open so parents can clarify expectations. For example, I've heard of families where there are 3 elementary school students and they all are supposed to be online synchronously at once, but they have 1 laptop. And so we have to offer flexibility to our students so that they can actually join us, and the parents don't have to choose which of my children gets to meet their teacher's expectations today. And it's also important to maintain in-person routines as much as possible, and this can be done through something like keeping a morning meeting. So depending on students' age, you can bring children into the conversation about setting up routines and give them some choice in their routines. Even young children can share their ideas about what works best for them. For example, do they prefer to start their work with math or reading? And it's important to offer opportunities for choice, especially during uncertain times, which we will discuss more later in the webinar. So look for another way of setting up a routine is dividing up tasks and looking for ways that students can do this themselves. For example, if your students have to watch a video, do some reading, answer questions, and then send the assignment back to you, we want to support students in breaking the assignment down into manageable pieces. Younger learners will need assignments divided up more than older students. And some ELLs may need picture support or home language support for these steps. If children are having trouble focusing, if you're hearing from students that they're having trouble completing their work, you can encourage them to create their own checklist of the different tasks needed to be completed so that they can see each step and feel a sense of completion as they cross off the tasks. I was a teacher and have known many teachers who have written things on their lists just to cross it off. It's a very satisfying feeling, and it can really help students who have a hard time focusing. You can see one example of a checklist on the slide. And Ms. G has shared as well that breaking down steps for older students is very useful as well. I find breaking down steps as an adult is helpful. So anything we can do to help our students stay on track and feel accomplished will really help them, especially when you're not near them to offer that in-person support. As much as possible, we want to provide immediate, specific, and positive feedback to our students. We can acknowledge the different ways that learning at home is more challenging than learning at school, and we want to celebrate those successes. So for example, you might say, you worked really hard to complete that math assignment, or great job focusing on your reading, even though there were lots of distractions at home. So we want to make sure that we're looking for the positive and highlighting it to students who may feel overwhelmed. A little piece of positive feedback can go a long way. We also want to build in movement, snacks, breaks, and playtime for students. And these are things that happen more naturally in the face-to-face school day. Students get up, they go to a different room. Maybe in elementary, you play a little video for a movement break, or they're going to gym. And so for the online school day, we want to make sure we're giving students chances for brain breaks as well. So this is the time to consider if there are any new class routines you might want to start during this time. For example, I've heard of older teachers of high school students having students share their favorite songs, and students can sing along or dance. And for example, I know an elementary school teacher sent a message each morning, which often included a link to a video movement. And Go Noodle is a great resource for movement breaks. And they have resources for sort of increasing energy and also bringing the energy down and calming students. It includes breathing videos as well. So finding those times to give students the movement breaks that they need, even in the digital classroom. It can be a really easy thing to overlook, but when students are sitting in one place all day, they need those breaks even more than they would in the face-to-face classroom. So the routines that we've been discussing extend to the home as well. Oh, someone asked what was the site called for movement breaks. It is Go Noodle, and I've shared it in the chat. So routines extend to home as well. A checklist of daily activities is something that you can recommend for parents looking to build routines at home. This is an example of a type of checklist that parents may choose to adapt for their families. It includes different categories of tasks. Families can start off the day talking about what students might do for each category. For example, in the reading time, the child may decide to read to themselves or listen to a read aloud that are available online. And these daily activities can all support language development for ELLs. What are some ways we can take advantage of students being home to support these areas through our assignments? Let's share in the chat. What are ways we can use some of these home activities, these daily activities, to support language development? Kelly shared talk about sequencing routines, right? That's a great way to build in sequencing language. Jamie shared through baking or cooking, building vocabulary and also math skills that way. Taking the opportunity to do read aloud with students. This could be a great way for students to work on home language literacy as well, if parents read to students in their home language. Students can write sentences describing physical activities, encourage family reading in L1. Oh, I love this idea of making labels for household objects in English or writing up their own schedule. Right, an oral language opportunity Denise shared for having students discuss what they do during free time using Flipgrid. These are great, thank you. So reflecting on routines, please take a moment to share in the chat successes you've had this year with establishing routines or ideas you have for establishing routines going forward. We've got daily Google Meets and weekly parent contact. Posting work on the same day every week, that's a great strategy. Giving students schedules, consistent color-coded materials. Having students use their own agendas. Posting assignments on multiple platforms to create a choice. A circle time. Oh, a workout of the week posted every Monday. Remind, right? People found the Remind app very helpful. Having office hours, word of the day, sticking with at most 3 to 4 platforms, right? We don't want to overwhelm students with all the different platforms they have to learn before they even get to language or content. Kinvo, which is like Remind. That's great. I haven't heard of Kinvo. Google Meet. Class Dojo, right? Class Dojo offers a lot of translation options as well. These are great, thank you. And keep them coming. WeChat, talking points. And if you're not checking the chat, I do recommend it since your colleagues are all sharing awesome resources. So now that we've talked about routines, we'll talk about maintaining connections with students and families. And these are challenges that came up in the chat when you shared at the beginning. So now we'll do a poll. What has been your biggest barrier for staying connected with students and families? And I'm sure that there may be more than one, but please respond to the poll that should pop up on your screen, and we'll share the results in a moment. Great, so most of us have voted. And technology seems to be far and away the plurality. And people are sharing in the chat as well. They weren't sure if Google Translate was translating properly. I've had that problem as well. Seniors often work overnight shifts, so catching them all for a live session has been impossible, right? I can imagine. Right, Carl shared that he's working with a probation program and they don't have internet access, right? So there are huge numbers of students who are just being left out of online learning for these reasons with internet, absolutely. Sharing laptops. Right, so we've had a lot of challenges staying in touch with families, absolutely. So now that we've talked about our challenges, take a moment to share in the chat the tools or strategies you've used to maintain those connections. What has worked? WhatsApp, Remind, Google Classroom, Nearpod, Flipgrid, Infinite Campus, Instagram, Talking Points, Seesaw, Zoom, good old-fashioned phone calls. Zoom, WeChat, emails through Google Classroom. And I'm sure finding out what worked took some trial and error as well. Building, oh, this is so important. Nicole mentioned building rapport with parents by checking in, not just to talk about school, but also to see how they are. Oh, Kelly also mentioned, I found even if their phone was disconnected, that WhatsApp worked. That's really important. Texting parents, emailing, right? And what works for one parent obviously won't work for all parents. So it definitely can take some trial and error. And hopefully going forward, now that if we are still digital in the fall, at least now we'll know what works best for families, and hopefully we can communicate that to other teachers in case they're working with the same families. Great, thank you. Without being in the same physical space, teachers and students don't have the same incidental interactions that can help build relationships. So we have to be even more intentional about building in those interactions. And this includes making time for one-on-one check-ins, as many of you mentioned, using small groups for instruction when possible, and holding office hours, as one of you mentioned. So another way to connect with students is through letter writing. And this is an opportunity to learn more about students' contexts. And someone's already asked this in the Q&A, how do you know if a student's home school life is distracting. And so this letter writing opportunity is a way to learn more about students' contexts, including questions like, do you have a quiet space to work? Are you sharing technology with siblings? Are you working or caring for a younger sibling? And Matthew Johnson, and this article is linked in the Padlet, is a high school English teacher, and he asked his students to write him a letter about how they were doing, how they were keeping busy, non-COVID-19 things in their life, and what they thought was manageable in terms of the amount of schoolwork they could do at home. And he learned a lot about how they were responding to the crisis, and it helped him establish a better system for online learning for his students. And the full prompt is online on the Padlet, and it can be shortened and adapted for English learners. So these do's and don'ts for maintaining connections between students come from Larry Ferlazzo, and it's linked on the Padlet as well. And he has a lot of great resources for working with students online. He's a teacher in California. So he says, do create opportunities for students to connect informally. So not just academic discussions, but like so many of you said, they miss their friends, and giving them time to connect with each other. Do make time for individual conversations with students, that one-on-one teacher-student time whenever possible. And don't apply a bell-to-bell attitude in the name of rigor. Be flexible in response to student needs. And don't limit your student interactions just to group chats, text, or email. A phone call can go a really long way. Larry also mentions he had ended a class and the students just wanted to hang out. And so he left the Zoom open for them to hang out with each other. So be flexible, be creative in the ways that you're giving students space to talk to each other. So we're going to look at a scenario, and you may have encountered something similar in your context. This is a real life situation from a teacher. I didn't make this up. So you're trying to have a Zoom call with a class, a synchronous class, and it becomes clear that one of the students is calling in from a doctor's office while her family waits for an appointment for a younger sibling. How would you respond to the situation? Please share in the chat. Right, give students a choice on continuing to listen in or to come back later. Thank them for their dedication, but let them know that they need to take this time for their family. Wish them luck and tell them we can catch up a different time. Try to set up another meeting. Remind students to turn off their camera if they aren't home. Let them take part in the meeting. Make sure they're on mute to minimize background distraction. Right, be accepting of the student's environment. They can meet later, right? Individually message them and give them the choice, right? We don't want to shame students and say, oh, you shouldn't be here right now. But we also want to communicate our flexibility to students so that they know if you're dealing with something with your family right now, we're not going to penalize you if you are in a doctor's office with your family. Have them mute their camera, give them an opportunity to catch up later, set up another time. I see a lot of people are saying that they would give the student a choice, which I really appreciate. Ask the family if there's anything they can do to help. Right, take note to ask questions later, text me later. We can look at it together when you get home, right? So really, it's clear that all of us are responding in the same way, that extending our time and our care to the student while not making the student feel too scared to disconnect when there's class. So this is an opportunity to extend students' flexibility. And I really appreciate what Joe has said. Ask the student if it's a good time to be on Zoom, and if not, tell them I understand if they're not able to stay, and that they'll schedule another session that works best for them. Thank you. So beyond our individual connections with students, we want to foster connections between students and build in and maintain classroom community. So this can be done with morning meetings, as mentioned earlier, shared experiences. I have colleagues in Brooklyn who've done pajama day over Zoom, show and tell, virtual field trips, scavenger hunts. I know an art teacher who had students collect objects. They were learning about the rainbow, and they had to collect all the red objects in their house, all the orange objects in their house, and create rainbows. I know older students who've done open mics with each other, sharing an art or skill. For example, a fourth grade teacher had students who submitted all their work by a certain time. They got to join a special lunch chat with a teacher. I heard another teacher say that if all the students completed their work, they got to vote on a virtual reward. Maybe they had the teacher wear her hair silly on Zoom. They got to bring their pet to a Zoom meeting, have a Zoom dance party. So really getting creative with ways that that you can build your community as a class. So we've talked about creating connections with students, and we'll now talk about creating connections with families. So in the chat, share, and you may have shared many of these already since you may use the same strategies for connecting with families as students. But if you have any strategies specifically for sharing with families, for maintaining connections with families, please share them now. Oh, and I have to highlight, someone shared in the chat, they did a road trip with their phys ed class, and students logged their miles and they traveled around the country. I love that. Okay, offering translated versions of lessons, video chats with parents, and the phone calls. The phone calls have really gone a long way, and I'm hearing that around the country. Trying to have parents join a Google Meet so they can see what their kid sees. A parent-teacher night with parents online, that's great. Using Screencastify to explain tools. Michelle shared that her school realized that they needed to do a Google training for parents ASAP, including ENL school staff in Google Classroom to assist. Voice notes for directions in English and Spanish. Write letters to students who don't have internet access. These are great. For connecting with families, it's really important to have clear communication around the tools and the expectations. And you may know this from your own children's virtual learning, that it can get really overwhelming for parents. So as several of you already mentioned, we want to offer supports for online tools, like videos and screenshots. And again, as already has been mentioned, maintaining connections with families beyond just academics. We can also maintain these connections with families by sharing community resources, nonprofit resources. Religious groups are offering a lot of resources right now, community centers, the YMCA. And there are many translation resources. Google Voice to text will translate, Talking Points translates, Class Dojo translates. Again, always with the caveat of it may not be perfect, but there are options out there. And again, as many of you have mentioned, supports for using online tools. So we linked on the Padlet a resource with multilingual tutorials for Zoom and Google Classroom, and they're available in more than just English and Spanish. They're available in many languages, and school districts around the country have been doing a great job of translating even in lower incidence languages. So definitely check out this resource on the Padlet. It's a resource roundup of multilingual tutorials. Do they support Turkish, Arabic, and Urdu? That depends on each translation option. Google Translate probably has the most, but can have varying accuracy. I know Arabic is available on Class Dojo, but each platform will have a different list of languages that they support. So there's a great Coloring Colorado article reflecting on lessons learned from around the country, and it's linked on the Padlet. So the lessons learned were that many families were not getting updates from schools in their language. That the article also shares the importance of identifying families' preferred methods of communication, including home language and preferred technology. And this would be a great opportunity to write down which methods worked best for each family. If you're going to be working with the same families again, or if you write it down, you can share it with a colleague so that hopefully we can avoid that trial and error in the future. The value of cultural liaisons or community members who may be able to provide important guidance on communication. Videos, as several of you mentioned, can be an effective way to communicate with families. Finding ways to stay connected to your students through the closure can make a really important difference. And most of all, it's important to keep family strengths in mind. And just with our students, it can be really easy to focus only on what they don't know, but we want to make sure that we approach our families with an assets-based perspective as well as our students. So here's another scenario. A student's mom contacts you, upset. The parents are divorced, and the mom explains that when the son is at their dad's, he doesn't get any help with schoolwork, and that she's concerned because she doesn't understand the math enough to help her son. So you get this email, you get this phone call. How would you respond to the situation? Please share in the chat. Offer extra help, like office hours, create a parent help, right? Offer to help the student individually. Right. Make sure that the parents know that the children can contact you directly. Get in contact with the other parent. I think we would also want to take a moment to let the mom know that we know you're doing your best. You're not doing anything wrong. You've already reached out to see how your child can get more support, and we will offer that support to your child. Yes, reassure the mother. Extra tutoring resources, how-to links, extra support. Peer interaction, right? Maybe give the student a math buddy, compliment parent for the effort, let mom know we can support him. Provide videos, right? Maybe the student would benefit from a Khan Academy video that they can replay and see in their own language. These are great, thank you for sharing. We also want to note that distance learning does present some privacy concerns, and we're, again, figuring that out as we go. And that undocumented students do face some risks with distance learning, and that digital learning can provide identifiable information. So talk to your district about platforms and data sharing and student privacy policies to make sure we're not inadvertently sharing identifiable student information. And there's an article linked on the Padlet, again, from Coloring Colorado, if you'd like to look into it more specifically. So we've talked about a lot of challenges. So let's take a time to share some successes. So if you haven't already, please share a success you had this year with maintaining connections with students and families. In addition, you can share any ideas you have for maintaining going forward. weekly Google Meets, weekly check-ins, right? I've heard teachers from around the country saying that their relationships with parents are stronger than ever, given all the one-on-one time they've spent on the phone. Weekly check-ins with parents. Ms. G shared having already gathered phone numbers and information prior to COVID. That was really helpful. Lots of phone calls and emails. Oh, attendance jumped on the meets because the students wanted to talk to someone. Students want that interaction. Phone calls. And there is a way using Google Voice that if you don't want to share your personal phone number, you can call and it won't be your number that shows up. Collaborating with other teachers I normally wouldn't, right? Collaborating with colleagues there are lots of ways you can help support your students through collaborating with your colleagues. Teacher collaboration was amazing. And again, if you haven't changed your chat settings to all panelists and attendees, please do, since I want everyone to see the great ideas you're sharing. Thank you. So we'll also talk about responding to ELLs' emotional needs. And first, we want to distinguish between stress and trauma. Since students may be experiencing one or both, it's important to know the difference. They're not exactly the same thing. So here are some key differences. A stressful event is intense or overwhelming in the moment, but you can return to regular functioning once the event is over. During traumatic events, coping skills are overwhelmed and it potentially unable to return to regular functioning after the event. And traumatic events can lead to chronic stress, hypervigilance, and limits in regulating behaviors. And trauma can impact language learning. So as we're thinking about what our students are experiencing, they could be experiencing one, the other, or both. So as we support our ELLs socio-emotionally, we want to start noticing their emotions and triggers. And it's important to help children be aware of their own emotions and triggers for those emotions. For example, do they notice that they're more likely to feel anxious after watching a news story about COVID-19? Or do they find that maybe if they sit at the computer for too long, they feel restless? And for young children, you can use a feelings chart to help them identify their emotions. And again, this can include picture support and home language support. For older children, we want to help them, again, notice their feelings and the triggers for those feelings. And you can ask older children to write about their feelings in a journal type format. And for ELLs who require more scaffolding, you can provide prompts and sentence frames. They can do this in their home language or verbally. And there's an example of a sentence frame on the screen. And someone shared that they had daily feelings check-ins in which students had to pick an emoji and say why they felt that way. That is a great way to, it's a great access point, right? Is emojis. I love that idea. So journaling is a great resource for even not in times of stress and trauma. Journaling is a great activity to do with ELLs, but reasons that journaling is great for this time is that it's flexible, it's differentiated. Students can have multiple means of expression. It can be through writing, it can include photos and drawings. Students can choose their language, and it records a momentous time in history. And a teacher mentioned earlier in the chat that students were doing a time capsule. So this is really, this is going to be a year that everyone remembers, and having that journal in the future would be a great opportunity for reflection. And certain prompts can give students opportunities to detach from their anxieties. So what would you do what would you do to help a friend who's really nervous, right? And that can help the students detach a little bit from their own anxiety. And in this reflection journal template on the screen that is on the Padlet, it includes prompts about who students have connected with in person and online, and it's available in French, Spanish, and Polish, and you will find that on the Padlet. And similar to the emoji check-in, this article by Kathleen Beachboard is linked on the Padlet and outlines trauma-informed practices, specifically in terms of distance learning. And one of these trauma-informed practices is a mental health check-in. And so to begin each lesson, this teacher had students fill in a form to indicate how they were feeling and share any needs they have. Another trauma-informed practice is a self-care plan. And these self-care plans validate students' unique mental health needs and their coping mechanism. So students identify activities that help them feel better. An example could be like these breathing techniques on the screen that are linked on the Padlet. They can identify who their sources of support are and list their stressors. And these self-care plans can help students prepare for bad days and also give teachers a guide for how to help students when they struggle. Another trauma-informed practice is giving students choice and voice, which we've mentioned a lot. And in an uncertain time where students have a lack of control over their environment, it can be really both comforting and empowering for students to exert control and voice, even if it's over an assignment. The same Zakarian article referenced earlier, which is linked on the Padlet, shares a story of a teacher named Ana Morales who asked pairs of students to create 2-minute presentations of their choice, a song, a poem, a poster, about their findings from an assignment. And they had the option of presenting live to the whole class or recording it. And she also gave students a choice as to how often they would check in with her, daily, every other day, weekly. So this choice goes a long way to comforting students during uncertain times. So I'm going to share several resources with you, and every resource I've shared on the screen is linked on the Padlet, so don't worry if you don't write it down. And all of the slides are also linked on the Padlet as well, so don't worry if you feel like you've missed something, it's all on the Padlet for you. So the NYSED site has specific resources for supporting ELLs with remote teaching and socio-emotional learning resources, including resources for supporting young people and families, self-care, and supporting adults. The CDC has a lot of information you can share with students and families, including multiple languages, and the National Association of School Psychologists has a COVID-19 resource center with a variety of resources for families to help their children cope with stress. And the same National Association of School Psychologists has this infographic on the Padlet with conversation tips about having conversations with COVID-19 at the different grade levels. And what are some emotional red flags to look for in different age levels. Ruler, I know that some schools in New York City are already using Ruler. It's a socio-emotional curriculum, and it's an evidence-based approach to social and emotional learning developed at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and it supports school communities in understanding the value of emotions, building the skills of emotional intelligence, and creating and maintaining a positive school climate. So if anyone is using Ruler and they found it helpful, please share that in the chat. We also have a resource of ours that we'd like to share, because our students are not only living through a health crisis that they have not seen in their lifetimes, but also a crisis of racial violence. And we've created a Padlet with resources for anti-bias and anti-racism education, including reading lists, education resources, family resources, and resources for understanding white privilege and what it means to be an ally. And it's on our website, on our Get Support Ed website. And we're updating it constantly as we come across new resources. So please feel free to check back, or it's open to adding your own resources. So definitely check that out as well. So we have another poll. Which of these resources would you like to explore more? Great, so it seems like every resource has someone who wants to check it out, and we've got a lot of people who want to check out our anti-bias and anti-racist resources, Padlet, which I shared the link of in the chat. So great, I'm glad that people are interested in these resources. So we also have a lot of resources in our communities that may be in or outside of our schools, including school counselors, social workers, community organizations, and national organizations. And now is a great time to forge relationships with those social workers in our school, the counselors in our school. Those are great allies during this time for supporting students. So we've talked a lot about the socio-emotional needs of students, but teachers have a lot of socio-emotional needs as well. So a survey of 5,000 teachers asked them to describe their 3 most frequent emotions. Anxious was by far the most frequent, as well as fearful, worried, overwhelmed, and sad. Teachers are balancing personal and professional stress, and teachers require social emotional support as well. And we could probably spend a whole other hour talking just about that. But I encourage you to check out this article on the Padlet and speak to your peers, speak to your colleagues about how you can support each other and the support you would need from administration at this time. So we'll take a brief moment to share any successes you've had this year for taking care of yourself. You've done a lot to care for your students and their families, but what have you done to support your own emotional well-being at this time? Meditation, exercise, journaling. I'm seeing lots of walking, mindfulness, evening walks with family, lots of baking, same in my house, gardening. And I hope that the summer is an opportunity for you to take care of yourselves and get the rest that you need. Great, keep these coming, and I'll keep going for the sake of time. So now we'll talk about applying these strategies and we'll wrap up the webinar. So distance learning obviously has had lots of challenge, but it offers us opportunities for one-on-one communication, differentiation, and student choice, as all of you have mentioned. Google Meet is a tool that many of you seem very familiar with for maintaining those connections with students, with their families, with colleagues. Google Forms, as we mentioned earlier, can be a great way to check in privately with students and can be a good way to gather student interests to provide choice. Marco Polo is an app where you can record short videos and send them to other users. And of course, check in with your administration before using any kind of social media with students or parents. But I know that some districts are fine with teachers using Marco Polo, and it's been a good way to keep in touch. So we have a few moments left, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. If we run out of time before I've been able to answer your question, my email will be on the last slide of the presentation. So please feel free to reach out to me directly. So we have some Q&A. Is Ruler a free curriculum? I think if your school wants to become an official Ruler school, that depends school by school. I know New York City has a partnership with Ruler, but I'm not sure how many schools it extends to. But I know they do have a lot of free resources online. Someone asked, for high school students, who is responsible for making the phone calls or contact with families of ELLs? Right, that's a great question. If your student has 6 teachers, which of those 6 teachers is reaching out? Are they all reaching out? And that's something I think you would want to establish with your colleagues, right? We don't want to overwhelm parents, but we also don't want to assume someone else is calling them and then no one calls them. So that's something I would definitely work out as a team, so there's a consistent point person for families. Someone else asked the best way to get information for parents. Right. So sending an email that parents might not check isn't helpful, even if it's compliant with state regulations, absolutely. And I think that comes down to, it's really parent by parent, and that's good information to keep track of, I had parents who you could never get on the phone, but if you called the store where the dad worked, he would always answer. So I had to make a note for every teacher who worked with that student, don't call the cell phone number, call the store. So this is information that's great to gather and share with each other, so we don't have to all do wild geese chases all over the place. So I think that's definitely parent by parent. Do you have a link for additional summer PDs? This is our last planned webinar with the Long Island RBERN, but we do offer 12-hour online courses, and I definitely would direct you to our website to check out the online courses that we offer. They are great for the future. Was attendance taken? Someone had trouble getting in. So I will say, I was going to say in a few moments, but please check, put in your full name and your district if you haven't already, and that's how your attendance will be taken. And again, if you're interested in more PD, definitely check out our free webinar archive. That's on our website as well. And definitely check out our anti-bias resources. Someone asked about anti-bias training. Okay, I'm aware of our time, so I'm going to keep going. I don't want to keep anybody late. So I hope you feel that we met our 4 objectives today. Again, if you attend the webinar live, you will receive 1 hour of CTLE credit, and thank you for entering your names to take your attendance. And again, my name is Marley Zeno. My email is up on the screen. We want to thank you so much for joining us today. Again, 9 a.m. on a Monday in June. I'm so impressed that so many people are here. We really appreciate everything you've done so much. And I hope that you have a restful summer and you get to take some time to do all of those nice long walks and meditation and your baking and your cross stitch and any of the other self-care practices that sustain you. So thank you so much. I'll leave up the slide for a few more moments in case you'd like to take down my email and ask a question. And I hope everyone has a great week. Thank you so much.